Crime in many U.S. cities is on the rise. And because of this, well, citizens in one Connecticut city have had enough with the government, and they're organizing to protect themselves. And guess what? Well, certain local politicians, well, they hate the idea. Let's take a closer look at this story and carry away some key lessons about history, individual liberty, and government itself. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV. You know, in political philosophy class, my students and I, we make quick work of exposing the yarn that the people create the government, i.e. the polis, to protect lives and property from attacks and threats of attack by other people. First, that implies that the imposition of the polis is voluntary, which is counter to the very difference between a polis and society. All political systems are imposed on people, while interpersonal agreements in society are voluntary. But second, the idea that people create the polis in order to protect their lives and property is undercut by the fact that the government mandates that you cough up portions of your wealth in order to fund the government. That's called a protection racket, not real protection. And residents of Hartford, Connecticut are starting to expose just how fallacious and unworkable that philosophical mythology actually is. Brian Yanes reports for Fox News that numerous residents of crime-ridden Hartford have taken up arms to defend their neighborhood after seeing the utter incompetence and waste of the government-based police force that eats their tax cash like carpenter ants might eat away the timber frames of one's home. Quote, the so-called self-defense brigade, made up of about 40 legally armed citizens, are voluntarily patrolling the streets of Hartford's North End wearing body cameras, mostly on nights and weekends, according to the group's founder, Cornell Lewis. Hold on now. How can people protect themselves? And with firearms, no less. I thought protection required involuntary servitude to the government. And that requires the government pointing guns at us to make us cough up tax money to pay the police that are supposed to stop aggression and people pointing guns at us to take our stuff. Well, of course, I'm being sarcastic, and that sarcasm is utilized to highlight the tautological arguments that statists use to purportedly justify their claim of legalized plunder, i.e. taxation, on us. But in this Hartford group story, we can see the canard of statism exposed in real time. These people actually are voluntarily joining to police their neighborhood, as opposed to the false narrative told to us by so many politicians that government is by the people, when by definition government imposes while society demands peaceful and voluntary association, and we have to agree ourselves. Well, these people are engaging in voluntary association, peacefully, uniting for their own protection. No government force necessary here, folks. Writes Yanes, quote, when the armed volunteers are not on the streets, the group monitors video feeds from a dozen drones hovering over the neighborhood and 75 home surveillance cameras in the neighborhood. That's pretty creative and likely a lot less expensive than the government-run, tax-mandated so-called protection of the political world. And in case you wondered, the city is run by Democrats who, generally speaking, oft excoriate peacefully minded people who want to exercise their right to keep and bear arms. And of course, these politicians instead demand that those people shell out tax money, or else see police come to their door to arrest them for not handing over cash called taxes. Yes. Those would be, of course, armed police, armed by the government and the politicians who don't like arms. I get it. Yanes' conversation with Mr. Lewis reveals even more about the group. Quote, "The Democratic machine in Hartford is either unwilling or incapable of doing it, and the people are paying their tax dollars and they're not really getting any kind of service," Lewis told Fox News. "So we want the people to understand, number one, self-defense is not a dirty word." And really, does anyone actually have a right to demand that one's neighbor pay for one's own protection? I can't tell my neighbor to hand over cash for my protection. That in itself is a threatening act of aggression. I only have a right to provide for my own protection, to accept offers of protection from others, and to join with others for voluntarily achieved protection agreements. I have no right to impose any of this on anyone, which is the manner in which the so-called justified government always operates, even as the politicians routinely proclaim that their own importance is key, and they deride anyone who wants to be left alone, and they claim that they're the problem. Harvard's Democratic Mayor Arunan Arulampalam has denounced the group over concerns they will enact vigilante justice. Curiously, in philosophy class, the students and I also break down the fact that any government-based so-called justice system isn't actually providing justice, because the system exists through the forced expropriation of money from taxpayers in order to function. Regardless of which parties win in any court situation, they all lose overall to the government, which absorbs their money regardless of whether they win or lose a particular case, and regardless of whether the people that the government taxes ever use the system or are ever thrust into the courts. And for those who still think the gangland operation of the government is morally acceptable, there are the practical problems of waste. And of course, the fact that the government rarely allows for competition. So people who are dissatisfied, well, they can't decline their payments to the government. They can't say no if they're dissatisfied. Well, it's a different story with these vigilantes in Hartford. Everything here is voluntary and focused on local ties, on neighbors, caring for neighbors. The group began patrolling the neighborhood at the behest of Archbishop Dexter Burke of the Walk in the Light Church of God. A shooting in February left 2 men dead near his church, and he had enough. "I feel that we are really putting a dent on crime," Burke said. "I think that we've exceeded 100% in terms of success." Burke says having community members invested in the neighborhood patrol combats the anti-snitch culture in Black neighborhoods. As for concerns that this is nothing more than armed vigilantes, Burke points to the use of cameras. The body-worn cameras and drones, he says, are meant to provide evidence of crimes to be turned over to police, but the cameras also provide protection to the volunteer members of the group. You know, despite the modern technology, this is how many societies handled protection centuries and centuries ago. Many contemporary Americans might not be aware of historical precedents of local policing and even non-governmental adjudication for disputes and crimes, justice systems. But this example from Hartford harkens back to the 1,000-year-long polycentric, voluntary Brehon law system of the Irish clans, roughly from the 7th century to 1700 AD, and also to the Goddard justice system of the medieval Vikings in Iceland. Local groups, societal, voluntary associations, they reflect and utilize honest dealing and individual valuation, something that appears to be greatly needed in Hartford, Connecticut, and possibly many other places in America. Thank you for watching, everybody, diving into this contemporary story and then taking some historical examples and putting them out there as well. Really appreciate you being here and finding us on Rumble, where they don't censor us. Please hit the follow and share the videos far and wide. Yes, you'll find us on YouTube still, where they do censor us sometimes, and you'll find us inside Facebook. The group is always hopping, and of course on TikTok and Instagram and on X. And please visit MRCTV.org. That's MRCTV.org to find out what the whole team is doing. Consider contributing to the Media Research Center and check out the MRC-TV store for some great items. If you want to find me, I'm on Gab as @GardnerGoldsmith, and I'm on Twitter/X as @GardGoldsmith. Thanks for watching, everyone. For MRC-TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.
I want to invite you as my guest on a very special, once-in-a-lifetime, 7-day post-election cruise in the Caribbean. It's going to be a blast.